I'm a counseling psychologist. I'm a clinical psychology registrar, and I also happen to be an accredited clinical psychosexual therapist, which is just a fancy way of saying I'm a sex therapist. And that's the area that I do specialize in, is in sex therapy, which basically means that clients that work with me, we're usually working in areas related to sex, sexual health, sexuality, gender, sexual trauma, and a lot of sort of issues related to minority stress, which is basically the acceptance of certain sort of cohorts in society, and discrimination they experience from broader sort of society.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting. I'd love to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, so it's this kind of theory that's sort of undergone a lot of research in the psychology literature, and basically what it posits is there are certain cohorts in society that experience greater levels of what they call minority stress, which basically means they're at higher risk of prejudice and discrimination from society. So very broadly, you see queer folk falling into that kind of umbrella. You can see sex workers falling into that umbrella. People who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color fall into that sort of umbrella, wherein, there's a kind of dominant culture in society that forms a lot of social narratives about what's okay and what's not okay. And typically they're falling on the margins of, being considered as not okay by that dominant cohort in some way. And the result is discrimination towards them. And of course, we know that the impact of prejudice and discrimination means you have less rights. It means that, people are targeting you for different kinds of sort of abuse or, microaggressions. And typically, your physical and mental health is poorer as a result.
When you're saying those things, it's like, yes, everything you're saying, I'm like, yeah, that is true. That makes sense. But I had
Mm.
never thought about it like that, like this societal stress that
Mm.
does happen to certain
Yeah.
groups of people and what that must just even kind of unconsciously do to them,
Yeah.
like this is a not the same, but a similar example. I feel like sometimes, and my dad brought this up to me one time.
Mm.
He said someone was talking on a radio show and saying, like sometimes people don't understand, like as a woman, if a woman's walking alone at night, there's a
Mm-hmm.
certain sense of just unsettled, unsafe that she's feeling. And no matter
Yeah.
whether even she knows it or not. And my
Yeah.
dad was like, wow, like, is that true? And I'm like, actually, it is true, and he
Yeah.
doesn't get that. And when you share this information, I think something similarly where it's like this kind of, whether you're even consciously registering it or not, there's just this sense of unsettled and stress, like you said, for certain
Yeah.
groups of people that's going to kind of affect their behavior, how they're feeling, their mental health.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's huge. And obviously, like we can go into sort of more detail, sort of if you wish. But like there's decades, centuries of history that kind of lead us to this point, and the kinds of like people that have power and privilege in society, and the kinds of I guess laws and policies and influence they have over social narratives and what people believe, and kind of access or restriction to education and certain viewpoints that sort of all combine into the experience that people have, people who are different in some way. And even if it's not sort of different according to their lived experience of everyone else in that group, but just from the perspective of that dominant cohort. And I think that's a really good example. Women's experiences of safety in society, that's a big one. And we can trace that back to patriarchy and this kind of idea of patriarchal structures controlling women's bodies. And because of all that control that's sort of exerted, and the way that that sort of is unfairly prejudices and discriminates against women, the outcome is you feel unsafe as a woman in society, because you have all these intersections of experiencing less rights, experiencing prejudice and microaggression. And whether or not you consciously know it, you're feeling it in some way, even though I guess in some respects things have sort of improved for sex workers, in a lot of ways things are still the same. And you hear when you talk to sex workers, and I'm talking more from a literature perspective, but even from lived experience, they're still talking about, like feeling prejudiced, feeling discriminated against, and that even though there's a bit more recognition, particularly in the camming sort of industry and online sex work, there's still this experience of feeling stigma, of people sort of breaking ties with them, of people judging them, of the persistent sense of shame. Like these don't go away just with kind of having more recognition. They are pervasive narratives in society, and for good reason. They are created to serve certain sort of groups in our society. And again, I think with online sex work, there's a big tie into patriarchy and the desire to control women's bodies and control sort of heteronormativity, which is this idea of you only have sort of straight couples as the only acceptable model, and they're only allowed to have sex with each other, and you're monogamous, and like all these kind of rules that are sort of formed historically that actually don't apply to everyone, not even to most, but that's the narrative that certain conservative society would like you to sort of think is the case.
When you're working with people that are feeling this minority stress, is that what?
Yeah, that's it. Got
That's
it.
it. How do you work them through some of these things? I mean, I'm sure it's situational, but what are some of the ways that people who may fall under this category can work to start healing or managing this?
Yeah, it's a great question, and let me talk in overgeneralized sort of
Yeah.
terms, obviously, so that I can apply to as many people as possible. But quite typically, it starts with education about what's happening, and I think you pointed this out before, which is that sense of it resonates, but you've probably never quite thought about it in that way. And so that's usually the first task for me, is kind of hearing the person's experience and then putting a bit of language and drawing a bit of a timeline of how we got here and maybe why you feel that way. And again, sort of people's experiences, they're very unconsciously or subconsciously feeling the stress, but they're not sure why. And then when you start to unpack that picture, they're like, yeah, I do worry. I worry that my family will find out. I worry, what this person is going to do. I worry about my rights. I worry about my safety. And so once you kind of develop that picture of that's what's happening, we can start to better appreciate what potentially is happening and what might be helpful for that person next. Typically, one of the things that's happening is that the person feels like an outsider in their community, and sometimes it's because they're not connected to other people like them that would help to normalize the way that they feel. So you see this probably slightly more common with queer folk, but it applies to nearly every sort of marginalized community here. But what you tend to see is this idea of the queer person kind of existing with very heteronormative family and peers and relationships. And of course, they feel like the outsider. And so everything they hear from those other people in their lives puts them in a position of feeling different. And then when they hear the microaggressions, which are sort of baked into social narratives, they're kind of believing them and going, yeah, I guess that's true. I do feel different. I do feel like maybe there's something wrong with me. But when we can kind of, draw the line that they're experiencing this from a certain slice of society, we can then kind of go, so what would happen if we exposed you to another slice of society where actually your experiences are really normal, meaning other people like you, and kind of move you a bit more adjacently to them, or even kind of connecting with them. And you tend to see at that point that a lot of the feelings of shame and feeling different start to be more normalized. And that is often a better place for people. They feel supported, cared for, understood. And you have this kind of almost reversing at times of experience where we're kind of now able to appreciate that that part of society is the different part. It's not us that's different. It's kind of them. Which then leads us to the next part here, which is dealing with things like internalized shame, which is another really big problem. When we have heard the narrative for our whole life that we're different, we feel different. We feel shit. We feel like, we might feel like the worst person in the world. We might feel like we're doing harm to people. And unpacking that is not inherently you. And actually, that's a thing you've been taught by others who are prejudicial and discriminative of you and people like you. That is the key to then being able to recognize that there are people who are prejudiced towards you, and therefore that's not what you think about yourself. That's what they think about you. And when you can separate those ideas, we can move into a place where it's possible to kind of renorm, what is okay and what's not okay, and then start to show ourselves some more compassion, and some more understanding and some more love. And I guess that's very broadly, and again, sort of, very overgeneralized. But for me, those are typically the main areas and the most common ones that come up in this kind of work.
As you were talking, it really hit home as true. I have my best friend in the world. We've been friends since the third grade. So we're
Mm.
talking about like a 20 plus year friendship. And
Yeah.
we grew up in this very religious school and system,
Yeah.
very strict Christian. Yeah.
Hmm.
And she actually got married to a man, and they kind of went through a separation. And she discovered that she, at the very least, is bisexual, but
Hmm.
may be completely just lesbian. And
Yeah.
she shared that with me because we're best friends and she knows me.
Yeah.
But when she met someone she really liked, another woman, and I'm like, you don't need to hide this, she was like,
Mhm.
yes, I do. She was like,
Yeah.
no, no, I'm going to lose business. I'm going to lose it. Like, my family's not going to understand. And
Yeah.
she like demonstrated really, like, it really broke my heart, and she
Yeah.
demonstrated exactly what you're talking about, where it was like, she even brought up about religion. Like, I just wonder what
Mm.
God thinks. And I'm like, oh, if God made you the way you are, you know what I mean? But it's
Yeah.
like, you have to like really, she didn't get that. That was
Absolutely.
not what was in her mind.
No, no, no. That
I
sounds
was,
like decades of conditioning and sort
yeah,
of, yeah, yeah.
exactly. And it's funny too because I don't know what happened, but I kind of broke out of the super religious system when I was younger. So I was a little bit more worldly where I'm like, this is totally normal. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of
Like,
course.
yeah,
And how wonderful to have a friend like you who shared a similar experience, who could say,
yeah,
actually, that's okay. And I think that's kind of what I mean when I was saying before, like you bring people adjacent to the kind of community that they're a part of, and the renorming is more possible because it's so credible to hear a message from someone who feels like us that says that's okay, actually, that's really normal, like that's, yeah, like I don't know where, who's telling you this is not okay, but I
yeah.
don't think they're the right folk you need to be hearing the message from. A big part of this work can be the management of safety in different pockets of our lives, and there is an element of masking that is required. And what I mean by masking is the decisions that you make to be cloaked so that people feel like you blend in and you're not very visible in the community, or group that you actually identify with. And we need to do those things because we know that there are real safety risks for people, emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse. They are things that come up way more often with marginalized communities. And for those reasons, sometimes we do have to make the very sort of distinct choice to say, I'm not telling these people because it is too dangerous to my safety on an emotional, physical, or sexual level for me to say who I am. But where we want to guide you to is eventually being able to feel okay to perhaps open up to these people who are safer people who can validate your identity. Because we know if you're masking all the time, chances are you're internalizing a lot of shame and feeling like you're not accepted. But when we can move you adjacent to a safe community and you can kind of go, I don't need to mask so much, you're then starting to connect with who you really are, open up and feel more, like I said, self-compassionate to your identity and what you need from the world.
What's so interesting about this conversation is that as you're talking, I'm thinking, and how many people though, which I know as, being part of Live Jasmine, a lot of members come to Live Jasmine actually because they may not fit the mold completely of being part of like a
Mm,
minority group, but
mm,
there is something that they have about
yeah.
them, or an interest or a fetish or whatever,
Hmm.
that they
Hmm.
do feel like they have to hide from the world and that they
Absolutely.
don't want to share for fear
Yeah.
of being judged or shamed, and for having that,
Yeah.
usually it's religious shame. So as you're talking, I'm thinking, how many people are just normal and don't have these aspects of self that they feel this need to hide in order to blend in and be part of the group, so to speak,
Yeah.
society.
Yeah. 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 And I think you're very close to the mark there. I think everything's kind of normal, really, unless it's sort of like, a threat to somebody's life. Like a lot of the what we feel is okay and not okay is coming from these kind of like social narratives that are created by very conservative religious sort of pockets of society with very high influence. Um, and it also kind of makes sense that, even if you get to the point of sort of making the decision to be an online sex worker, or a sex worker of any kind, you might still internalize some of that sort of shame and kind of go, I'm okay with this part, but this part still is a thing that I've heard a lot of negative messaging about, and it feels like there's something off there, and internalize that sort of shame. But at the same time, if we flip the narrative, we're also seeing that things like online sort of sex work does something to society that's really helpful, which is it normalizes things. It normalizes, like you said, kinks, fetishes, sexual practices that other people can't connect with very easily, and that they might have a lot of deep shame about, sort of, as and in this case, like your clientele or consumers, like that might be very hard for them to access, is now kind of more possible because of camming services and online sex work, that they're able to find, again, people like them, people who enjoy the same kinds of sort of interests as them, and they're able to feel more normal. And this is an example of moving a person adjacent to the community that they want to be a part of, that they feel like they're a part of. Online sex work kind of provides. So it's such a valuable form of sex education in some way to people, where we haven't sort of previously had that kind of like pre-internet or even pre-social media. And it's a really important one, I think. Models are taking a lot of emotional labor in listening, in talking, in connecting, in supporting. And I hear this narrative from sex workers that I work with, that sometimes they feel like therapists because they're doing a lot of this kind of therapeutic support work, that maybe these people are not engaging other people in their lives with. And for good reason, because sometimes these are people who are in marginalized communities, disability, kind of queer, maybe they're the only people sort of with a certain kink or fetish. And the model feels like the only person that might actually understand them, because again, they're connecting at that identity level sort of with them. So it's such an important role. I don't think that can be understated.
You mentioned one of my favorite words, and I think one of the most powerful words: connection. Your experience, your perspective.
Mm.
What does connection play? How does it play into our lives? And how does it play into our
Mm.
sexuality?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think when I think about connection, I'm going to think about it in a bit of a psyche kind of way. There's usually two things I'm mostly kind of thinking about. Firstly, it's what our brain is kind of hardwired to do from an evolutionary perspective. As kind of people, our mind's job is to keep us safe in some way. from an evolutionary perspective as early humans, being part of a group was really powerful. Connecting to other people was really powerful. Why? Because when we were part of a tribe, we were protected, we were safe, we had more resources. We didn't have to kind of like wander into the wilderness and be sort of, at the whims of wild animals, wild weather, warring tribes, like starvation, all these kind of things. So we were really protected in groups. And when we were not in a group, we were at risk. And our mind is kind of hardwired to still think that now. And when we're not connected with people, we feel this kind of threat of, I feel alone, I feel exposed, I feel vulnerable, I feel at risk. So I
Yes.
think that's one kind of level of it. Like when we're not part of a group, there's a real sort of detriment to us in terms of feeling unsafe. Then we've got the other perspective in terms of the whys of why we're here on this kind of planet and what our meaning is. And this more existential sort of view of relationships bring us meaning. When we can bond with somebody, when we can feel understood by them and accepted, and like there's a reciprocation and a kind of trust and ultimately a connection, we can kind of resolve that our meaning in this world feels kind of like it's about relationships. It's about giving to people. It's about being part of certain relationships that are meaningful to us. It's about giving back to communities. It's about setting the world in a way that kind of privileges and benefits future kind of people that are coming into that world. So I guess when I think about connection, I'm thinking about it at those two levels. It's important as a survival instinct, and it's important as meaning as to why we're sort of on this planet. And so then I guess when we're funneling down to what's the role of sort of sexuality here and kind of sexual intimacy, well, those are the fundamental kind of parts. They're not really changed. For us to be sexually intimate with people, we still kind of need a connection there. We need to be able to feel connected to the person, that there's a sort of likeness there, that there's a sort of trust, that we can be vulnerable in their presence without being in danger. You know, that's important to sexual intimacy. So, like, it's all about connection, really. And I think if I'm conceptualizing people, who use online sex work and who use camming services, that's the thing. It's the connection that's allowing them to be able to get to that place and to feel vulnerable enough to connect with models.
I think when we kind of go back to our roots as humans, like you just did, these historic, almost caveman roots, where it's like, hey, if you weren't part of the tribe, you were at risk for death. Ultimately,
Mm,
your survival
mm,
was in question. If you're part
mm,
of the tribe, your chances of survival are much better.
mm,
And that is still part of our DNA. So, like you said, when we feel very alone and cast off, there is just this sense of, okay, I'm not fully safe, like
mm.
my survival is at risk.
Yeah,
Um, and then just, this, I don't know if I've ever heard anyone say about connection the way you have, where it could be looked at as our purpose. And,
mm,
when you find purpose there with others, that's one of the most blissful experiences, as we all know, whether it be family, a partner, a friend, a community, uh,
mm.
a charity, an animal, just like that
Yeah,
connection gives you purpose.
absolutely.
That's why
Absolutely.
if you have like your grandparents or older people tend to have like a small dog or a
Mm.
cat or something if their
Yeah,
family has moved out, there's something to that connection that I think keeps them going and feeling good.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I think when we don't see that, it's pretty clear what the effects are. Like there's just hundreds of studies on the subject. You see people feeling, lonely, low self-worth. You can see antisocial behaviors sometimes. You can see poor mental health outcomes, sort of depression, anxiety, poor sleep, you can see physical health issues, like low immune system, sort of like heart problems, like and all the way up to quality of life. Like we know people who are connected with other people tend to live longer on average than people who are isolated. So there's just so much that can be traced back, not only to the kinds of relationships we have, but meaningful relationships that we have. Because again, and I think where we started this conversation was, you know, you can have relationships that are not good for you, that make you feel worse about yourselves. That's not the relationships we're talking about. We're talking about the ones where we feel safe, accepted, acknowledged, cared for, and sort of like that help us feel like we belong in some way. They're the ones that are really meaningful. And I think in some ways, when we think about like online sex work and the marginalization of certain people, it's one of the things that it's kind of given us is the ability to kind of go, I feel different. And this model is kind of like me in a lot of ways. And I have no one else in my world who has ever kind of connected with me in the same way. So this is meaningful. This is a meaningful relationship to me. This is a meaningful connection. And that has the power to do all those kind of good things that we see sort of in the research in terms of the sort of like positive physical and mental health and well-being sort of effects.
Absolutely, because you start releasing those feel good hormones, right? You get some of that
Yeah, yeah,
oxytocin going, some serotonin, all of them.
absolutely.
That's the good stuff.
Absolutely it is.
Yeah, really interesting. I'm curious, you know that saying opposites attract, but
Yeah.
so like attracts like, and what I kind of heard you say is a lot of times people are finding these similarities that they feel they have with other people, and it
Mm.
makes them feel bonded or share, like you said, share a vulnerability and
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And I think when I'm talking about that kind of area here, I'm talking again about that sort of real human need to belong. And it's sort of, again, if we're going back to that sort of very early human sort of survival instinct, if we're growing up in a portion of society, let's take the example of like a very religious upbringing with very set rules about how you have relationships and what kind of genders and sexuality is okay and which ones are not, you're not feeling like you're really part of a tribe because it doesn't fit you. So when we're then thinking about the kinds of people that encourage you and that you feel supported by and that you feel like you have a likeness to, it's not really that group, but we can find that by either sort of finding people in our community who are like us. And one of the biggest things that we know is that some of the most common channels for that are places like, sort of like online sex work, or like internet kind of communities that have a very sort of niche space. That's where we sort of first start to be able to explore that idea that there are other people like us, and we're seeking that likeness, we're seeking that connection, we're ultimately seeking who is the tribe that I belong to? Because when we don't feel like we belong, that's an existential crisis right there. It's we don't have meaning in the world. We're like, am I the only one who feels this way? As soon as we have that thought, like, you can guarantee that, probably your emotional and mental well-being is not great. If you feel like you're the only person who is like this and that it's a bad thing. As soon as you can find anyone else who is like you, that changes. It's like, wow, there's another person like me. I belong. I'm accepted. I'm loved. I'm, acknowledged in some way. I'm not different. I'm not this sort of different being that this part of society has made me out to be. And I think, again, that's the power of social media. That's the power of internet. That's the power of online sex work, to allow people to connect with those sides of themselves that are more historically stigmatized or taboo by conservative society.
While you were talking, I had this thought, because you see so many headlines, and I'm not exactly sure what the actual research is, but younger people these days are just spending their time online and they're not engaging as much in their day-to-day life or with their family or with their, whatever. And I'm thinking, maybe because they feel like they don't fit in with the family, but they found a Facebook group where they feel like it's a similar vibe, or, they get these people. And so, of course, they're going to want to pour into that group as opposed to the one that's even in their physical
Yeah.
reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've touched on something that's really important here. And it's this kind of social discourse that's about uh, something about technology and the internet and social media is kind of killing human intimacy in some way. And you hear it so much. But it's again, it's kind of important to interrogate that narrative and go, so who's sharing that narrative? And usually, yeah, there's a conservative element to it. Usually there's also a kind of this message is coming from neurotypical people, it's coming from extroverts, it's coming from people who place a higher value on in-person relationships. But as soon as you can kind of strip that away and go, all right, who doesn't agree with that? You start to see a louder voice that comes from people who are neurodivergent, who have disability, who are more introverts, who have more flexible understandings of relationships. And nowhere do you see this more than with younger cohorts of, like kids and adolescents. And when you ask them the question, who are your friends? And they say, oh, this person, this person, this person, this person. And then when you kind of ask them, who's online and who's offline, it's a mix. They don't see a distinction. For them, a friend is a friend. And really, online, offline, we're just talking about channels of communication that do the same thing. They still allow them to kind of connect and bond and receive support and intimacy. They're just different ways of going about it. They don't see a distinction. And I think that's the important part is we need to listen to the voices of people who are benefiting from digital connection with other people. And again, seeing it as just another way that we connect. And we've had these throughout history, letters, postcards, mobile phones, and now it's social media and the internet and video. They're no different. They're just different ways that we've evolved to find ways to communicate with each other.
Oh, it's fascinating. I'm so glad you shared that perspective. There have been people who have shared the similar belief, but they haven't articulated it in quite the same way. A lot of people have this idea of like, no, in person is king. In person
Mm.
is what matters most. But I also, what I was in a Facebook group actually, and I was watching a back and forth between two people, one of whom is my friend. And she also shares a similar belief that it doesn't have to be about in person or touch. And someone was saying, no, we have done studies that babies that were not touched, they developed disabilities, they were sickly, and the babies that were touched, they were healthy, they were this and that. And my friend, I was so impressed and proud, but what she said has so stuck with me. She said, was it the touch that did that, or was it the love and the touch was the avenue?
Wow.
It's like,
That's very well said.
right? I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to chew on this one for years. You know what I mean? Like it like wow. It's so,
Yeah.
and that's similar to what you're saying, where it's
Yeah.
not about necessarily where it comes from. It's
Yeah.
about what it is, which ultimately is it love or not, because like the imaginary example I gave of maybe a kid that's online more than he's spending
Mm.
time with his family. Maybe he doesn't feel loved by his family, but he feels loved
Exactly.
by this community.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's where we see it the most is in adolescence, is this is a period of life where people are developing their identity, their autonomy is separate from their family. They're not feeling like they're quite the same or understood. They go online and they find that. In the past, you might struggle as an adolescent to find your tribe. And you might kind of sit in a space of loneliness and isolation, whereas now we have the means to find your tribe more easily. If you have a particular hobby, if you are a particular sexuality or gender, you can go online directly and find it. It's given us so many more opportunities to find who our people are and connect with them more directly. What's the problem there? You know, there isn't a problem. It's actually a really wonderful thing. And I think moving back to your friend's kind of observation there, that's just so well said. It's this idea of, I think we place a lot of emphasis on sort of cherry picking these studies where, you know, there was touch or no touch without realizing that there is a vehicle there for showing empathy and support and love and caring, and that ultimately it doesn't matter which channel we use as long as the main ingredients are there. It is not the touch. The touch is an expression of love and intimacy and connection, but it's not the only way. Yeah.
Fascinating. I've loved this conversation so far. Um, I'm curious, on that note, I
Yeah.
love asking some of my experts this question, which is if you could share one message with everyone in the world about human connection, sexuality, sex, that you don't think the world quite understands yet, what would
Mm,
that thing be?
yeah. I think the message would be that there is such a beautiful spectrum of sexualities, of genders, of ways to play sexually that we can't even comprehend. You know, some we know, some we don't know, some we're yet to discover. And that one of the most beautiful things and one of the most important things we can do for ourselves is to be always curious, always learning, and always kind of accepting of difference. And I think when we're able to kind of capture those three things, always curious, always learning, always kind of accepting of others, we can really start to appreciate just the diversity of human sexuality and what that kind of means away from the narrow bands that we've kind of historically been told this is okay. Um, because I think when we start to kind of recognize that and connect with that, we just learn so much about ourselves. And there's just such a greater empathy that we can sort of develop toward sort of each other and other people out there. And it makes us into better people. You know, as opposed to this idea of when we stick to this kind of band and we have no curiosity and we don't have a desire to learn or accept, we're just kind of stuck in this very sort of small and rigid and, you know, often hateful kind of world that's sort of intolerant. But when we can kind of appreciate sexuality over here as a beautiful sort of spectrum, it just makes us better people in so many more ways. It enriches our kind of connection, our intimacy, our understanding. And I'm willing to place a lot of money on the fact that it produces more meaningful relationships with each other as humans. So that's I guess my sort of message. Keep being curious, keep educating yourself, and yeah, keep a sort of flexibility on accepting sort of each other's difference.
Yeah, I think that word was what I heard you say really, which is being accepting. And that is one of the greatest forms of love. I think if someone can feel accepted, that's like one of the
Mm,
most powerful things in the world when you truly feel accepted for who you are. And to be honest, it's one of the reasons why I think this industry and platform is, multi-billion dollar industry because
absolutely.
people are finding these pockets of feeling accepted. And that's so
Mm,
valuable for them that
it
they're
is.
willing to pay for that feeling?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. And I think you nailed it. That is absolutely what one of the biggest draw cards is for people. That feeling of connection, that feeling of finding people that are like them that they didn't know were out there. Like that is a thing to pay money for. That is a thing to seek out. And it's just such a beautiful thing that we have that available compared to sort of this era of human history where we didn't and we had to suffer alone. how much better the world is because of this sort of industry and other kind of technologies that allow us to sort of explore these types of connections.
Very well said. I want to ask you if there's any piece of research that you've seen throughout your career that you just, when you saw it, you were like, wow, it really stood out to you or shocked you or surprised you?
Yeah, probably nothing in particular, but one of the things I always love tracking is when you see the kind of like national sex surveys. I think they're the most fascinating, and probably like if you're not going to read any other literature, check out those annual sort of ones. So often by Kinsey sort of Institute sort of publishes them, but sort of your government probably sort of releases them periodically. They just give such a wonderful and typically unbiased kind of view and snapshot of what's happening in your society at the moment, in terms of sex, sexuality, and gender. And I think what's really telling about it is that and I direct a lot of the clients that I work to different sort of stratifications of the data, but we can often have these views of even within our own kind of communities, this is really normal and this is not. And then when you look at those research, it really broadens it out and you kind of go, wow, like that's not what I thought at all. So like, for example, I have a lot of people that talk to me about, certain types of sex, feeling like, oh, everyone's having that type of sex but me. And then when you look at these kind of national sex surveys, you kind of realize, ah, yeah, actually, that's much less than I thought. Or, you can have these ideas of, just how big the composition is of, gender diversity, of sexual diversity, and like, oh, yeah, I'm definitely like the only person or in the minority. And then when you look at these surveys, it's like, no, like there's a lot of people sort of out there. And these are like thousands, tens of thousands of sort of people. And, it sort of really gets into fine-grained detail, like, how often people have sexual fantasies, what their sexual fantasies are about, like, and when you start to unpick that, you really realize that we're more alike than we are sort of different, in a lot of ways. So I think very much keeping an eye on sort of Kinsey Institute sort of reports and national sex surveys. They're absolutely fascinating, and I definitely encourage people to look out for them.
I did not realize that those were a thing. And now I'm going to check out my area. I feel like, what's going on around here? Keep an eye on Los Angeles.
Absolutely. And I think like it's really funny. Like, and I know that Kinsey were probably the first ones to start running these annual sort of surveys, but that's kind of where we got data that, people's sexuality is fluid, that there are more queer folk than we thought about, that people actually fantasize about some pretty creative stuff. Like it's as a result of these surveys that kind of force us to confront reality that it's not this narrow band that we're being told about. It's this beautiful spectrum of how we experience our sexuality. Yeah.
This has been such an incredible interview. I've loved it. I'm curious if there's anything about any of the topics that we've touched on or that are related that we haven't talked about, but that you just want to share.
Understanding the history of colonization by religious white men, often who are cisgender, and the influence over history that that has had on the ways we think about gender, sexuality, sex, and how conservative it's kind of been told to us that it needs to be, and the impact on restriction and comprehensive sex education and the vilification of sex work and the kind of narratives that it's only monogamous, married, and straight vanilla sex that is okay. It's understanding that that's where that's coming from that gives us the opportunity to then say, well, what can we do? What are the meaningful differences we can make in society as people, if that's the case? That feels like a big task to sort of address all that sort of prejudice and discrimination. How can I make a difference? And I think there's a lot of difference we can make as individuals. And it starts with educating ourselves and kind of realizing, what are the things I know? What are the things I don't know? What are the things that there is yet to learn for me? It's about passing that education along to other people. It's about calling out and calling in people who have intolerant sort of views on sex work, on queer folk, on sort of any other intersections sort of in society. It's about the kind of like advocacy work that we can do to kind of call attention to the fact that, we're not comprehensively educating our youth, that about sex and sexuality and gender indifference. It's about making available sort of sex education. It's about helping people understand the very valuable role that sort of sex work plays in our society as an educational tool, as a connection tool. And then it's about kind of how we role model that in our society and carry ourselves as an example of change and the kind of world that we want to create, sort of for ourselves and for others. Yeah, and that's probably, I think, an important message there in terms of like when we feel like we're drowning with all this kind of microaggression, prejudice, and stigma, what can we do? There's actually quite a lot that we can do, and it's very much a strength in numbers kind of game here.
Beautiful. I always end the interviews by asking, what are some steps we can take to create a much more sex positive society? But I don't need to ask you that.
Those ones.
What are your thoughts on that? Yeah, I think you answered that question. Yeah, very well said. And I really like what you said about educating ourselves around, okay, where did this belief set come from? And is it actually mine? Because for some people, I'm sure that standard uh template that we've all been given, that works for them, but it doesn't work for the depth of everyone, which you've really driven home well. It's this idea of understanding and accepting that, what's right for me, it's okay if it's not right for you. Um, but we're still all in this together. So let's just be kind and loving and accepting human beings.
Couldn't have said it better myself.